Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. Today we're going to be taking a look at something which I think will interest a lot of you, and that is how to connect any payment provider that you want to your Wix website through a native integration that will look and feel exactly like the payment providers that Wix offers out of the box. We're going to be doing it with something called the Payment Provider Service plugin, which used to be called the Payment Provider SPI, and after adding those few code files to our website, essentially we will have a native flow checkout exactly like the Wix one, just with our payment provider. And it will look something like this. So when we go into our settings, we will be able to connect to our own custom payment provider like this, exactly in the native way. When we go to checkout, we will see that payment provider here as one of the payment options, just like if it was one of the payment providers Wix offers. And after we place an order, we will see those orders inside of our dashboard, just as if we had used another payment provider to complete the checkout. And we are going to be doing this today using Stripe. You can do this using any payment provider of your choice, and I'm really going to be focusing on giving you the tools to complete the integration for your own solution that you need, and not specifically for Stripe. Before we head in, I just want to give one small note and let you know about this opportunity, which is the channel memberships, which just opened recently, and that is an option for you to join the Wix Wiz more intimate community and be able to see videos ahead of time, to see videos that are for members only, such as the Velo for Beginners course, and even, depending on your membership level, attend some private member-only live stream Q&As where I will be there live and answering any questions that you have on a monthly basis. So if you're interested in that, please go ahead and check out that join button that should appear under the video, assuming you have already subscribed to the channel, which I hope you did, because I wouldn't want you to miss out on these videos whether you're a member or not. And without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, let me just go over my setup, and apologies in advance for my slightly nasally voice. For some reason, I have a stuffed nose pretty much on a very sunny, nice day out of the blue. So bear with me. And in terms of my setup, what I have here on the left is the Wix editor. Okay, so this is where we're going to be implementing the SPI, or actually what is currently been changed to be called service plugins. If you can see over here, Wix has kind of shifted between the language of SPI to service plugin, but it's pretty much the same thing. And I've already installed the Wix Stores app. So you can see here on top, I have a link to the shop up here. And another thing that I've done is I've upgraded this site to be a premium Wix site, because what we're going to be implementing here is not going to work unless your site is upgraded, because generally all of the payments don't really work in Wix. At least you can't go through to the checkout page without having an upgraded site. Over here on the right, I have a few things open. So I first have this tutorial for implementing this service plugin, or SPI, and we're going to be following along quite closely with this tutorial because there are a lot of steps and there's no way I would have remembered this all by heart to walk you through. And this is definitely how I recommend you do your implementation as well. And today we're going to be doing the implementation with Stripe, but remember that this is generic, so it is supposed to integrate with any service provider, any third-party payment provider that has an API. The nuances might be a little different, but generally what I'll be trying to show you is the steps that you'll need to go through with your payment provider. So our focus is not going to be on Stripe itself in terms of learning how to use Stripe. We are going to use the Stripe documentation, which I have open here as well, but really as just an example payment provider, and not necessarily because I want to teach you how to implement Stripe specifically, but generally how to use this SPI or service plugin or whatever they'll call it in 3 months in order to allow checkout from your site using any payment provider that you want. Okay, so hopefully you've got everything all set up and you're ready to go. And the first thing we're going to be doing is creating a new payment provider plugin, formerly SPI again. And in order to do this, first thing we're going to need to do is to turn on dev mode or code mode. And then we can do that right over here, up here inside of the editor. And I'm just going to go ahead and click turn on dev mode. And we're going to be doing a little bit of coding today, so I hope that's okay with most of you, but hopefully the principles will be quite straightforward, and there are a lot of code examples inside of the tutorial, so even if you don't have a lot of coding experience, I think that you might be able to get away with copying and pasting and just making a few alterations, but it is always better if you do have some basic understanding of what you're doing. So let's go ahead over here, and I'm going to head to public and backend right over here. And then here you can see that we have the option to add the service plugins here on the bottom. You may notice that what I have here looks a little different than what we're seeing here on the right in the tutorial because they are using Wix Studio and I am using Wix Classic. So some things look a little different, but the important parts are the same. So here we have the service plugins, and I'm just going to click here on this plus sign right over here. And here we have a long list of all of the service plugins, SPIs, that we can add. And today we're focusing here on, let me see if I can find it. Where is it? Not validation, not payment settings. Let me see if I can find it. Shipping rates, payment. Let me find that right over here. Payment. Okay, I would have I would have never found that without I mean it's called the payment provider SPI, but it's pretty generic here, but luckily we have this tutorial here on the right that shows me exactly what we're looking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click right over here, payment, and now we get to start adding in the plugin. So I'm just going to click start now, and we have this little legal notice. And I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And now I get to give a name to the plugin. I'm just going to call mine Stripe because that is the payment provider that I'm implementing. This doesn't have any functional implications. It's just a naming. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And there we go. So here you can see that some folders have been added in and some files as well. So we have the payment provider service plugin, specifically the Stripe implementation. And here we have two files, so config and Stripe.js. And now we're going to learn exactly what we need to do in order to set up these two files. So generally, we're going to be setting up three things in this tutorial. One is the config or the initial connection from the dashboard. And that's what you can see over here. So if you've already attached a payment provider using Wix, then you kind of are familiar with this format here where you go like into settings and accept payments and you connect a provider of some sort. And here we're going to be exposing a provider and we'll need to provide some kind of account information to make that connection because Wix is not going to streamline that part for us. After we've set that up, there are essentially two more parts. They're quite large in terms of implementing this plugin. And one of them is how we communicate essentially with the third-party provider. So how we gather all the data about the cart that we're checking out and the payment that needs to be made. And we give that to the third-party payment provider and generate some kind of payment portal based on the provider. And the second part will be to essentially listen to the payment provider to hear if there's any responses or any updates to payments and stuff like that in order to make updates on the Wix side. So again, we're going to follow along here with the tutorial and we're going to start with the config. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see an outline of what needs to be included inside of this get config file. And this really outlines what every single part is, and some of them are required and some of them are not, and that's specified, let's say for example over here, so payment methods is required. And we also have an example here which is really handy. So we see here essentially we have the title, and then here we have the different payment methods. Okay, I'm going to implement just one single payment method like they did here. And in order to test this out, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy this code that they have right over here. And essentially what we're going to want to do is we're going to run a return that from this get config file instead of throwing a new error. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to return, and I'm just going to paste that object right over here. So currently, obviously, it's not set up to look like Stripe. It's going to be something that's called like banana payments and have all of these, SVGs and stuff that they put over here. But I just want to check and see that this is working and also show you what this is going to look like inside of the dashboard. And in order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to publish the site. Before I do that, I recommend having your logs open. So the site events, you can find that here inside of Developer Tools. And the reason I recommend doing that is because if there's any issues when you're publishing the SPI, you'll see that over here. And that will be the first indicator that something's wrong and you need to fix it. And you won't go ahead and start testing and not understand why things aren't working. So really only if you see in the logs here that the SPI/service plugin was published correctly, then you should go ahead and start doing your testing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish the site. So I went ahead and I published the site, and now I'm just taking a look here at the site event logs, and I'm really waiting for that indication if this SPI was published correctly or not. And there the publish went through, and I don't see any site events at the moment. There we go. Okay, so your site was published with an update to payment provider integration Stripe. Okay, so I don't see any errors. It made the update. And this is also an important note that, to the best of my knowledge, and the last time that I checked, only the site owner, and this is something very unique inside of the Wix environment, and I've been telling them about it a lot and begging them to fix it. So if you've seen otherwise, then let me know in the comments. But to the best of my knowledge, only the site owner can publish these SPIs. So that means if you're a developer and you're working on somebody else's site and you've integrated this SPI, you're going to have to give them a phone call or send them an email and tell them, okay, please publish. And obviously you can understand how this can slow down the development process because essentially you can't really test this without publishing to live. You can't test this in preview mode. So just note that if you're not realizing, if you see some kind of error here, like there was a error publishing your SPI, internal error, please contact us, or something like that, that's the indication that you should ask the site owner to try. If that still doesn't work, then you should really contact Wix support. So that was just a small anecdote here for publishing SPIs, true for all the SPIs, not only this one. But here it seems like my SPI was published. So let's head into the payments area and see if I can now see the config for this new payment method that we added. Okay, so here I am inside of the accept payments area in the dashboard. And you can see that this is under settings. If you're trying to look for it, you could also just kind of search here up top in the search bar. And here are some of the standard payment providers, so WixPay and PayPal. And here you can see that under them we have this new payment provider. Believe me, it's new. Wix does not offer a payment method called Banana Payments. And this is essentially the representation of that config file that we just set up. So you can see it's called Banana Payments. And it's weird that there's no icon at the moment. Maybe the link that they had there in the tutorial expired or something. But generally, this would be one of the icons that you provided there in the config. And once we go over here and we click connect here on the side, then we're required to provide there seems to be some problem with the images in the tutorial. There seems to be, so here inside of account information, we need to provide whatever we set up in the config. So if I am using Stripe now, for example, I'm going to need to see what information I need from a user in order to access their Stripe API. So it might be that we need some kind of ID and secret, and it might be something else. It really depends on your payment provider. Every provider will be different. So you have to see what kind of account information you need for the authentication and then set up the config accordingly. And we'll do this in a moment for the Stripe API itself. And so this is what it's going to look like once you get it set up. So now that we see that something's happening, that we have a proof of concept, let's move forward and make the adjustments so that this is actually appropriate for our integration, which is going to be Stripe. Okay. So here we are back in the editor, and I'm going to start setting up this config file to be a Stripe integration and not a banana payments integration. So I'll call this right here custom, let's call it custom Stripe payments. And I'll do the same right over here. So within the payment method, I'll call it the same. And to be honest, I haven't investigated completely what the implications of implementing several different payment methods would be. But typically, like let's say with something with Stripe, especially if you're using the Stripe checkout, once you take them to the checkout page, I mean, they'll have all the different payment methods there. So I have a feeling that for most payment providers, this is not relevant. I guess it would be if you wanted to like list those payment options in the checkout page and take them to different checkout methods based on what they select. I think it's quite niche, but again, it might have a use case. And it's always better that it's built to scale and not to scale. Here for the billing address mandatory fields, I'm not sure here if I'm required to have at least one or not. I usually try to like do the minimum possible when I'm doing an initial integration. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and just get rid of this and have an empty array here. And we'll see if that causes some kind of problem. In terms of the logos, what I could do, so here we need also an SVG and also a PNG. Yeah, so, and we also need white and colored. Let's see if those are required or not. So we have the logos. Yeah, so it doesn't really specify if the logos are required or not. I do recall trying this one time without the logos and it not working. So my recommendation for now would be to have the logos. Since these logos were working and logos are not a critical feature of this implementation, I'm just going to leave what Wix has there at the moment, which as you saw was like nothing, but at least I know it was working. And I'm not going to waste time on that, so let's skip the logos. And in terms of credential fields, so now we really need to investigate and see what credentials we're going to need for our Stripe integration. So let me go over here and take a look here at the Stripe documentation. And what I see here for setting up the server, let's see, I'm gonna expand this to be full screen just so I can see what's going on here. And okay, so here we have, I see some kind of API key. Okay, so we have a test secret key. And I don't think we need any other key in order to implement Stripe. So for now, it seems like we just need a secret API key. So that's what I'm going to integrate into the payment provider. If we find out later on that I do need something else, then we can integrate that as well. So what I'm going to do over here is for the credential fields, I'm going to get rid of one of these two credential fields. And if you needed more, you could always add more here in the array depending on your payment provider. And this, I'll call this, so here we have a name and a label. So just to clarify what that name and label is, so the name is the key that we're going to use later on in our code. Whereas the label is what we actually are going to see inside of the connector, inside of the dashboard, which I just showed you. And I see here that we also have, okay, so you have the option to add different kinds of fields also, by the way. So this is a simple field, which you saw is just like a regular text input, but we also have the option to have, let's say, a checkbox field or a drop-down field. Again, it would be like based on the payment provider or something like that. Maybe if you wanted to control something just here through, it's kind of like just settings for the API that would be easy for somebody who didn't necessarily have any kind of coding finesse to make alterations to the integration as opposed to needing to change things in the code. So again, I'm just going to focus here in terms of credentials on what we actually need for Stripe. So that's just a simple field, just an input, text input. And in the code, I'll call this API key. And, or, I'll call it secret API key, just to be 100% clear, secret API key. And here inside the label, I'll also say secret. Now let me zoom in so you can see what I'm doing, API key. Okay, so now if I go ahead and I publish these changes to live, and I didn't do what I told you to do, which is to go into the logs and make sure everything is working. But let me just try refreshing here and checking. It is still good advice though, even if I didn't do it. So here we are in the settings, and you can see here now that it's changed essentially, and it's called now custom Stripe payments, and all the naming has changed. And yeah, here in terms of the fees, I don't even know how you would possibly set that through the config. Maybe there is a way. I'm guessing that if you're doing this custom setup yourself, then you kind of know what the fees are already, but this could be useful if you're trying to build something more to scale or an integration that you're doing as a developer, and you just need the site owner to be able to understand what they're seeing and make the connection. And here you can see that we now have only one input for the secret API key, where we're going to put our Stripe API key. Later on, once we actually do a little bit more of the integration, and then once we do that, we should be able to kind of click this connect button and actually make the connection. So now we're pretty much done with the config part, and we can move on to the next part, which is actually getting the checkout to offer Stripe and to open Stripe when we actually decide to check out with Stripe. Okay, so now that we're done with the config file, for the next step, we're going to be hopping here into Stripe.js or whatever you named your SPI.js. And here we're going to be implementing three different functions. So one is connect account. Then we have create transaction. And we also have refund transaction. So create account is a function that's going to run when we click that connect button that I just showed you in the dashboard. And essentially what this function is meant to do is to create an account for this specific user with the payment provider. So for example, if you're using something like Stripe Connect, or you need to essentially create a Stripe account for the person that's using this payment method, then you would want to implement that logic here inside of the connect account function. We are using the SPI, the service plugin, in a slightly different way because we're trying to connect the site directly to the Stripe account that this person owns. So I'm assuming here that we have a site owner that has a Wix website, and they also have their own personal Stripe account, and I'm trying to connect between those two things. And since I already know that they have an account with that service provider, I don't really need to do anything inside of this connect account function. Okay, but we still do need to return certain information from the function. Okay, so you'll see here, essentially, example return value. Okay, so this is an example of what needs to be returned from the function. And we have here essentially the credentials, we have an account ID and an account name. And if we check out here the service plugin reference, that's essentially a Velo reference. That's right over here. That kind of goes a little more in depth into each of these like functions and stuff like that. So if I go over here to connect account and I try to take a look here at what needs to be returned. So I do see here credentials, account name, reason code. The question is what is required and what is not required. So I'm going to do a little bit of playing around with that because we definitely are going to want to have our credentials and specifically like the client secret, let's say, which we can get using this options parameter that's being passed into the function. But the question is if I need this account ID and account name, because that's not something I'm actually going to need in order to use the API. But it could be something that Wix requires us to return from this function. If it does, we can just return some random gibberish, and that should be enough for us. So let's go ahead and try and set that up over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get our credentials from from this options parameter. And just to show you here, so we have here options, and if I go ahead and I expand that, you can see that part of the options is the credentials. So I'm just going to extract that over here inside of the code. So I'm going to say const credentials. I don't know if you hear that honking or not, but welcome to New York City equals to options. Okay, so I have the credentials now. And these credentials is also part of what I need to return. So I'm just going to have here return. And one of the things that we're going to be returning is the credentials. And the other stuff that we might need to return is the account ID and other stuff. But I'm going to just try and do this for now, because this is really everything that I need. Not that Wix needs, but that I need to make this work. So I'm going to try it like this, see if it works. If not, we'll go ahead, we'll add in that account ID and whatnot. So I published the SPI. I didn't get any kind of error at this point. So let's go ahead back into the settings. And what I'll try and do, I will enter a fake API key here. So I'll just write, let's say, test. And I'm going to click this connect button to see if it works. If it does, I'm going to assume that this stage is complete. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click connect. And it's connecting provider. And it says that it was connected. Okay, custom Stripe payments is connected, and I didn't get any errors here. So I'm going to go ahead and assume for now that we're all good with that connection part. This might come and nip me in the butt later on in this tutorial, but I don't see any error messages, so I'm going to assume that for now we're good, and we've essentially passed on those credentials from the connection stage to the next part, which is we're going to talk about, which is creating a transaction. Okay, so the next stage will be to deal with this create transaction function. And essentially what this is going to do is this is what's going to initiate that interaction with the Stripe API, essentially pass in all of the information about our card and whatnot. And eventually our goal is, if we scroll down here a little bit, what we're trying to do here is to get to these two things, which is essentially the plugin transaction ID, which we'll be getting from the options. And this, okay, so this is our main goal. This is what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to the redirect URL. Okay, the URL that we're going to get from our provider that will essentially take us to the checkout with that provider. So take us to that like Stripe page that you probably know with like where you put in your card details and everything like that. Okay, so that is our goal here. And in order to facilitate that goal, Wix is going to be providing us with all of this information over here. So we have transaction ID, we have the merchant credentials, which we just set up with the connect. We have information about the order that the person is checking out, etc. And this is an important moment to note that the example that we're doing now is going to be with Wix stores. To the best of my knowledge, this will work with any place that you're using checkout on Wix. One place where I've been told by the team where it doesn't work, this was a few months ago, so maybe they've fixed it since then, is that for recurring payments. So for example, if you're using pricing plans on your Wix website, I'm not 100% sure that that is supported, that this integration is supported for something like that. Okay, so anything like Wix stores, Wix bookings for like a one-time booking, yeah, I'm trying to like maybe Wix events or something like that. Like anytime you're doing a one-time transaction checkout, this should hold. But for situations like recurring payments, you might want to double check before you you start this integration, because if it doesn't work, that would be a bummer. So let's go ahead and start testing this out. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to do two things. Okay, so first I'm going to want to set up basic interaction with the Stripe API and make sure that that's all working. Once we've tested that out, I'm also going to want to check out what this object looks like in reality on my website when I'm actually doing checkout from the store. And then we're going to use those two pieces of information to essentially make a checkout using Stripe. So let's start with the Stripe side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and create a new backend module. And we're going to be using the new web.js. You could also do this in a .jsw file if you're still using those. And I'll just call this here Stripe as well. I'm being very original with the naming today. And let's head into this module. And essentially what we're going to want to do here is integrate this Stripe connection that we have here. I'm using the basic Stripe hosted page, which is what they recommend and I'd recommend too, which essentially means that all the elements for the checkout itself will be on a page hosted by Stripe and not on a page on your website, which totally makes sense with this kind of integration. I don't really see how you do it any other way. And in order to do this, we'll be using the Stripe Node.js package, the Stripe library. And you could also do it with direct calls to the API, like by using fetch or whatnot, but this will probably be a lot more simple. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And the first step to do that would be to install the npm package. And again, this is all going to be very specific to Stripe. So you're going to have to go into the documentation for whatever third-party provider you're connecting and look at how to make an API call for them. And every API is different. So I can't really give you any general strokes for this, but the general idea will be to essentially create that. We're trying to get to that checkout URL. Okay, that's our goal here. So I'm going to go ahead back to our site. Let me just put this right back here on the side. And I'm going to head over here to Packages and Apps. And I'm going to install packages from npm. And I'm going to look here for Stripe. Okay, I know the name of the package is Stripe because I can see it right over here. So npm install save Stripe, so that's the package that I'm looking for. And this seems to be right over here, Stripe API wrapper. So I'm going to go ahead and click install. And once that's done, we can start to implement the code that we see here. Awesome. So it says view, we're installed. And now what I'm going to do here is essentially I'm going to create a web method that will call this API. So I'm going to get rid of all this code that we have over here. And I'm going to copy the code that we have over here in the Stripe documentation. Here, I was looking for this copy button. So I'm just going to go ahead and click copy right over here. And I'm going to paste it here on the bottom. And now we're going to try and make some changes here to make this actually work with our website. So first of all, this const stripe equals require stripe, etc. So that I'm going to put right over here inside of our web method, inside the function of our web method. So right over here, essentially, I'm going to have getting Stripe, okay, getting this Stripe object. And we don't need Express or app or whatever because we have our own server running on Wix, so we don't need any of that. And we don't need this either. We probably will need our domain, so I'm just going to put this right over here on top because that is something that you might need if you're implementing other web methods as well. So I'm going to put it outside the function. And obviously we're going to want to change this to our actual domain. So in order to do that, I don't remember what the domain of this site actually is. So I'm going to go here to view site, and I'm just going to copy the domain from right over here. Okay, that's going to be your domain. And I'm going to paste it right over here. Okay, so we got our domain in there. And now essentially, so this app.post, whatever, that's if like I had a server on Express, that's how we would call this endpoint. Since in Wix it works differently and we don't call endpoints, we get web methods. So we actually don't need this, and we don't need this, and we don't need this. And we also don't need to redirect anyone anywhere. So we just essentially need this. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that here inside of our web method. Okay, right over here. And what we're going to need to do here is, at the moment, we're not going to have any parameters. Later on, we are going to have one parameter, which is going to be the API key. At the moment, my API key, my test API key, because I'm kind of in test mode now with Stripe, is hard-coded into this function because I just want to run a test and see that everything is working. But later on, this will come from our SPI integration. Because remember, we saved the credentials over there. We didn't save it, if you've seen some of my other tutorials, in the secrets manager where we usually put API keys. But instead, we have let the user provide it through the service plugin or SPI connection. And we're going to need to pass that on to this function when we call it from the SPI side. But at the moment, since I'm just running this in the backend just for testing purposes, it's hard coded here. Okay, let's see what else we need to do to make this work. So we have this await issue over here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change this into an asynchronous function. And we have this session which is coming back and we're not doing anything with it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to return session. And here we have some settings. So we have automatic tax enabled. I'm going to turn that off because it seems like it's excessive. And at the moment, I always like to first do the very basic. So whatever's the very basic that's required. Mode payment, I would need to look more at the Stripe documentation to see what exactly that means. So I'm going to leave it for now. We have a success URL and a cancel URL. So these are going to be important. And these are going to be pages that you'll actually want to create on your site. And if I'm not mistaken, there might be some integration with regard to those and the SPI as well, but we'll see that later on in the tutorial. If not, whatever your success URL and cancel URL are, you'll want to put them over here. And these are going to be essentially pages on your website that Stripe will redirect people to if the payment went through or didn't go through. So those are important to set up. We'll take a look at that later. And here, okay, here is another part that we're essentially going to be passing in from the SPI later on, and that is the line items. Okay, so line items are essentially the items that are in the cart, and here we see that we have a price and we have a quantity. And for this price, what we need to pass in is something called a price ID. And this price ID is something that we're going to need to generate within Stripe. So I'm going to head over to the documentation and see exactly how we are going to create this price ID for Stripe. So here I am inside of the Stripe documentation, and Stripe actually goes through everything I just explained to you guys. So I was kind of aligned with what's going on here. So we have, the mode they explain about, the success and cancel URLs, and I'll put a link to this documentation in the description. If I forget, it's docs.stripe.com/checkout/quick-start. If for some reason I forget to put the link in there, because sometimes I say it and then I publish this like in a few weeks and then I forgot already. But yeah, if you can comment and then I'll remember. So here's the part where I really wanted to take a look. And essentially the way Stripe works, and again, this is Stripe specific, every product that you're doing Stripe checkout for is essentially a product that needs to be defined in Stripe. So either you can define products directly in Stripe, or you can create products on the fly, which is more relevant to us because we're essentially getting all the product info from Wix, and we want to just provide that directly to Stripe. So if we want to create a new product that Stripe is telling us here, we're going to do it with something called the Price Data API. So I'm just going to go ahead and open that in a new tab. And here we have some instructions about how to do this. Let's see, create a session, items.price data, and data required to generate a new price object line. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so we need to click that. Let's see. Prices, create a price. So it creates a new price for an existing product. So what we want to do is essentially create a product actually. So that would be over here and create a product. Awesome. And then we're going to get a product ID. So I wonder if there's a way for us to pass this product ID instead of the pricing ID. Let me check that out. Line items. Provide the exact price ID of the product you want to sell. Okay. So we're essentially going to need to create also a product and also a price ID. Again, this is very Stripe specific. So let's go ahead and do that very quick. It shouldn't be too complicated. Essentially, we're going to want to grab all of our line items and create products and then a price ID. So I'm going to walk back a bit on what I said a second ago. As I was like peering into this and getting ready to actually implement it, I noticed that inside of the price API, we do have the option here. So I noticed this product data parameter. And here, if we take a look at the docs, then it essentially says that this can be used to create a new product while you're creating the price. So we don't need to first create the product and then the price. So instead, we can just do it all in one place, which is much better. So let's try and implement this price endpoint over here. And what we'll do is I'm going to create a new function right over here, and I'm going to call it async function create price, or I'll say create Stripe price, just to be even more specific. And here, in terms of the parameters, let's pass in, at the moment, I'll just pass in, let's say, product name, and we'll also want to pass in the unit amount, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the price. So let's just take a look here at unit amount. So this is a positive integer in cents. Okay, and I recommend, if you're doing a Stripe integration, to look into this, because these can be different if you're depending on the currency that you're using, because not all currencies have cents. So like I know that, let's say for yen, they don't have cents, so it actually works a little differently in terms of what this number means. So you'll definitely want to do a little more research about that if you're doing the implementation. I'm doing it now just for USD. So essentially, we want to give a positive integer in cents. So 0 for free price. So that means that essentially 1,000 should be $10, right? Because it's 1,000 cents. So that should be divided by $110 if I'm not mistaken. So let's have here also, I'll put in unit amount. And I'm going to copy over what we have over here, and I'm going to put this right here. And again, here again, I'm hard coding the API key, which later on we're going to want to make passed in through the parameters. And essentially what we do here is we create this price, and then what I'll do is I'll return what I need is essentially just this price ID, right? We just need this price ID. So let's see here inside of the response, we have this ID property. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return price.id. Okay, because that's essentially all that I need. And here for unit amount, we'll populate this with the parameter. In terms of recurring, I'm not going to include recurring, and I'm pretty sure that that's not required. No, recurring is not required. So all we need is product if we don't create our own product, which we are, so we can ignore that. We do need the unit amount conditionally. We won't look into that too much. Okay, that's the conditionally part. And we do need the product data. We don't need that, we don't need that. Okay, so we don't need this recurring here. We do want to provide the product data, but for the name, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pass in the product name like that. Okay, so we have a function essentially which is going to create a Stripe price based on our products. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to take our line items and we'll want to essentially create one of these products for each of the line items. At the moment, since we haven't done the connection with the SPI yet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some mock data. Okay, so I'm going to go over here, and what I'll do is I'll say const line items equals to, and what we'll have here, sorry, this is going to be an array, not an object. This is going to be an array, and we'll have here product name. Obviously, this is going to be a little different when we actually have it on the Wix side. What we could do actually is, I just thought of an even smarter idea than what I'm doing now. We can go to the SPI documentation where they had an example of line items here, right? Right over here, we have these example line items. So we can actually just use this, because this is actually the format that we're supposed to have eventually. So I'm going to grab that right over here, and I'm going to paste it right over here. And I'm going to want to have, let's say, 2 line items just so we can see how it would work if we had more than one. So let me go over here, and I'll paste the same thing under it. And I'll just change this to banana pants, and I'll make it, let's say, 20,000 here. And again, I'm not sure how the pricing works from the Wix side. We'll have to look into that. I'm going to guess that it's similar to how it works in Stripe. So this is in cents, essentially. So this is $100 for a shirt. That's quite a pricey shirt. And $200 for pants. So what we want to do here, inside of our function, which is calling the Stripe API, what we'll want to do is we will want to say const line items, and you'll notice here that I'm using the same formatting in terms of the writing as we have here for the property line items. Okay, line items equals to, and we're going to map our line items up here, so it'll be line items dot map, and for each item, what we'll do is we will essentially return await, and this is going to be an asynchronous function, so I'll do that over here. And we're going to do create, what we'll want to do is we will want to do the following. We're going to say const price ID equals to, and I'll explain why I changed my mind here in a second. Price ID equals to await, and we're going to say here get, no, what did I call it? Create Stripe price, and we'll pass in the item dot name and the item dot price. But this item price, this needs to be a number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say parse int item slash price. Let me just zoom here to the side so you can see everything that I did. Parse int item, whoa. Okay, so essentially we're passing in the 2 parameters that this function requires at the moment. And once we get back the Stripe price, what we'll want to return here is essentially an object, which is parallel to this object over here. So essentially you'll see that our line items, it's an array of objects with price and quantity. Okay, so this is the information that we need to transform our Wix line items into. So I'm going to return here an object with price, and the price is the price ID, so price ID. And the quantity, should essentially be item dot quantity. Okay, something like that. And then here, instead of creating a new, passing in like a full array like this, all we have to do is pass in line items. Okay, because we're defining that right up here on top. And I'm just going to change one last thing, which is the name of this web method up here. So it's not multiply, but it will be get Stripe checkout URL. Okay, that's essentially our goal here, right? If you recall. So I'm just going to format all this code, take a glimpse at it. It looks decent. We might do some refactoring in a moment, but for now, this should work if I run a test. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make this full screen, and I'm going to go and click this blue button right over here, which will allow us to do functional testing. We don't have any parameters, so I'm just going to go ahead and click run. And hopefully what this will do is it will, the line items parameter is required in payment mode. Okay, so this might have to do with the mapping issue. Love a good debugging session. Let me go over here. So essentially, it was saying that we don't have this line items property. So let me go ahead and I'll add in a log here, console.log line items. And this will be line items. Whoops, line items. And let's see what we get over here. Let's also see if our create stripe price function is actually running. So what I'll do here is I'll add a log console.log price ID. Awesome. Let's go ahead and give that a spin. So I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to clear our test and I'm going to run it again. Let's see what our logs say. Okay, so we got two price IDs, we got line items, but they are empty. Why are they empty or I just can't see them? Let me see, copy JSON. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna paste that here. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it's an empty object. Empty object. So that means essentially here there's a problem with how I built this return. It's always whenever there's a map, whenever there's a return inside of the map, I always get confused with it. I feel like this is right though. Map. Let me just check the map docs and make sure I'm doing this right, and I'll be back in a second. So I'm back, and it wasn't a problem with the return. I did the return right. The issue is that because we're using async await within this map, apparently what it returns is still a promise, which is interesting because like here the logs did log the resolved promise. So I assumed that what would happen here is that because we're waiting for price ID, by the time this returns, then it would already return the resolved promise. But it turns out that's not the way it works. So essentially, at the advice of ChatGPT, I'll give credit where credit is due. I added this right over here. So await promise.all, because essentially what's going to happen here is that this, assuming that these are essentially unresolved promises, it's going to be an array of promises, and promise.all is essentially a way for you to wait for an array of promises to be resolved. So that pretty much just kind of puts the icing on the cake here. So it's just this line here and this over here, just so you know kind of what I added in. And if we take a look now at the functional testing, just go right over here and run an additional test, then everything is working nice and dandy. Right over here. So we can see that we're getting the price IDs like we were before, and now the line items are actually exist and are being logged. And we also got this return value from the Stripe checkout. And we can see here that we have lots of metadata, but what's really important to us is this URL right over here on the bottom. Okay, this URL is going to be our checkout URL. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm not sure if I can copy it from here. I may need to copy this entire JSON. I'm going to copy the JSON and let's see, I'll just paste it here. Yeah, awesome. And I'll grab this URL. Very long URL. Selecting URLs. That's the one. That's one thing I want to see improvement here in the Wix IDE. Okay, so I copied the URL, and now what I'm doing, I'm going to paste it here inside the browser, and okay, basically what we can see here is the checkout. I'm going to pay without link, let's say. Okay, I've used this account to test Stripe checkouts before. Um, and this is not my actual visa, so don't even try. Not that you'd be able to do anything with just four numbers, but basically, yeah, here we can see, so we have our $100 shirts and pants. I hope you really like bananas. And essentially the person can initiate checkout through here. Okay, so this part is working. And now essentially what we want to do is just connect that to our SPI so that it's using the actual live data from our Wix store or whatever checkout we're doing in order to create this checkout URL. Okay, so now that we've set up the Stripe connection, we saw that it's working essentially. Let's head back to our Stripe.js, the one inside the SPI, not the backend that we were in before, and take a look at this create transaction function. So essentially here, we're going to want to do a few things. So we're going to want to get these options, and we're going to want to extract the line items from those options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, first I'm going to do console.log options, just because I want to see what's in there. Options and options. And then I'm going to want to extract here two things. One thing I mentioned already, which is going to be the line items. So let's just see what that looks like here. So we have, it's under items. Oh, so it's order items. Let's take a look here at the reference. So payment provider, create transaction, and options. And okay, so we have order. And we have, where do we have the credentials? Payment method, merchant credentials. So we're going to have here merchant credentials, and we're going to have the order equals to options. And then here within the order, we're going to have ID, description, return URLs, Wix merchant ID. Hmm. Description, let's see, description, items. So we want essentially order description items. Okay, so that's what we'll do over here. We'll say const line items equals to order dot description dot, you can't see, items. And then what we're going to want to do is we're also going to want to call our backend module. Okay, that's going to be the next step. And we're going to, at the end, we're going to want to return. Okay, if we take a look here at the documentation, we're going to want to return this. Okay, we're going to want to return plugin transaction ID, redirect URL. Let's see if there's anything else that we might want to return. Okay, so you can also return optionally. So this is a little confusing, I think, the way the documentation is written, because essentially it's showing this as all as like one thing that you're returning, but usually you'll return one or the other if I'm not mistaken. So either we'll return the plugin transaction ID and the redirect URL, or we'll return all of this error reason code stuff, which is essentially a way of conveying different errors. So if we take a look here, just like take a peek for a second, so we have these reason codes. And you see here there are a lot of different things that can go wrong with an online payment. And to be honest, not all payment providers give robust information about what went wrong. So Stripe is pretty good, probably one of the best. So if they don't have all this, then I don't think anybody does. But the likelihood of you having all of these error codes to provide or knowing what the causes of errors are is very much dependent on the payment provider. We'll do one example of like error handling, but I'm not going to do a very robust setup in terms of really analyzing all of the different Stripe error codes and correlating them to the Wix error codes and whatnot. It really depends also on how robust of a solution you're trying to build. Like if you're building something in-house and all you really need to know is that there's an error and then you'll go and investigate it yourself, then you need like one level. If you're building something that you're providing to other people, then you might want to do something more robust within what's possible for the provider that you're doing the connection for. So that was just in a nutshell about the error codes. But essentially what we want to do is ideally we want to return this. So let's first deal with the successful situations. That's going to be right over here. I'm just going to paste this right over here. So we're going to have the plugin transaction ID, which if, again, we take a look here at the documentation, it's a property that represents the payment provider's ID for the completed transaction. Okay, so that's going to be in the response that we got from Stripe, which I already got rid of. There'll be some kind of ID there that we'll pass on. I don't remember exactly what it's called, maybe session ID or it has a name. We'll check that in a moment. But essentially, this is going to be some kind of ID that we get from Stripe, and this is going to be the actual redirect URL that we're going to send the user to. And we're going to get that all from our backend module. But first things first, I just want to run this as it is. And hopefully what we'll see is that when we check out through our custom Stripe checkout, we'll be redirected to this URL, and hopefully we'll see a log with all the options. And specifically, I wanted to check and see what the merchant credentials look like, just to know how to set up the rest of our integration. So I published, and I'm on the live site. I've gone through like adding a product to the cart, proceeding to checkout, filling out all the details just to not bore you. And I'm at the payment stage of the checkout. And you can see here first that I have custom Stripe payments selected by default because that's the only provider I connected at the moment. If you had multiple, then you would see like those options for selecting one or the other, like you saw in the tutorial, or you might be familiar with from your Wix website. And you'll notice here that the icon is still the banana payments icon, even though this is not banana payments, this is Stripe. And we're ready to place the order and pay. I do have the logs open here just to be ready to see whatever comes out of this. So I'm going to go ahead here, place order and pay. And awesome. So this this works because you can see here that now I'm at example.com/redirect, which if you recall, that is what we put here as the redirect URL. Okay, so we were redirected to wherever we told the system to redirect us. If we take a look here at the logs, then here I have the options logged over here. And I can take a look and see. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, so merchant credentials, and it essentially uses just directly the name that I provided, so secret API key. That's what I wanted to just double check here. If you want, you're welcome to peer at some of the other information that we have here. But now that I have this piece of information, I'm ready to complete the rest of this part of the integration. And essentially what we're going to want to do is to do several things. So we're going to want to take the secret API key. So I'm going to say here const API key equals to merchant credentials dot secret API key. So now I have the API key and I have the line items. So I'm ready to call our backend module. I just want to make a few slight adjustments. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here to our backend module. And first of all, I'm going to change the name of this web method because we're not going to be only getting the checkout URL, but we're going to get the entire checkout object. And the reason is because I also need the checkout URL, but I also need the ID that Stripe, sorry, getting very nasal here, that Stripe is going to provide. So I'm going to get rid of that. And naming is a very important part of writing code. So I really, if something changes, change the name because, you know, a rose by any other name is not a rose, okay? So get Stripe checkout. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be passing in a few things here as well as parameters. So we're going to pass in the API key. That's going to be super important. And we're also going to pass in the line items. Okay? And we can comment out these line items that we have here for now that we were using for testing. And once we get this API key, that's what we're going to be using over here. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to say API key. Whoop. Okay, that's what it looks like over here. And we don't need this log anymore, so get rid of it. Always get rid of logs that you're not using. I'm going to get rid of this log here as well. And last thing that we're going to want to change here is that when we're creating the Stripe price, we're also going to want to pass in the API key. And we're also going to want to have that over here as well. So API key, like that. To be completely honest with you, you might have picked up by now that we technically don't have to play by the Wix rules and provide this API key through the connection of the payment provider. Like I could have easily just stored this API key in the secrets manager and just got it here in the backend, knowing that I'm the only person using the site. I know who the payment provider is. I know the client. I know everything. I know what's supposed to go where and what's supposed to be connected to where. So like you can go around the system, but I'm showing you how to do it like the right way. But yeah, like you probably picked up by now that this API key, I could have easily just also put in the secrets manager and left the integration pretty much as it was, instead of actually providing this API key through the integration. So that's just a side note. But yeah, so this is all set up now. API key, and here I also want to switch this out so that this is also the API key. Okay, just like that. And this, I think, is ready to go. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to head back into my dashboard. I'm going to disconnect. Let me go ahead and do this. Let me do this all with you. Wait, before that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Before I do that, okay, so we have the stripe.web.js all set up. And what we need to do now is we need to actually import this function, okay, into our integration. So I'm going to go here to the stripe.js. And here on top, I'm going to import this function from backend slash stripe.web. Okay, just like that. And then here, I'm going to get rid of this log because we don't need it anymore. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call our backend module. So I'm going to say const stripe checkout equals to await. Okay, anything that you're importing from the backend is always going to be a promise. Get stripe checkout. And here we're going to want to pass in the API key, and we're going to pass in the line items. Awesome. Once we have this Stripe checkout, so we're ready to provide these things over here. Let me get rid of these. I always like it when it's like nice and blue and up, even though it works both ways. So here for the redirect URL, we're going to have the Stripe checkout, Stripe checkout dot URL. For the transaction ID, we're going to need to double check the Stripe documentation. So I'm going to go over here and let me open that right up. So let's open here Stripe documentation. And let's see. Do I have an example of what it returns here? Server.js. Let's see. No. Checkout session. And session object ID. Checkout session. Yeah, that's what, is that what we're going to want? I think that's what we want. Checkout session. Let's see if there's any other ID that we can provide here. I don't think so. Yeah, so let's just provide that checkout session ID. Okay, so it's just ID. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's going to be over here, and it's going to be Stripe checkout.id. I'm not even sure what we need that for in the future, but yeah, we'll figure that out. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So that's set up like that. Now we are ready to do what I was going to do before, which is to go ahead. I'm going to publish the site, and I'm going to head back to our dashboard, and I'm going to disconnect our payment. Or actually, no, I don't need to disconnect it. I'm just going to switch. I thought I would need to disconnect and reconnect, but I can actually just switch this secret API key here. So I'm going to grab the API key from Stripe. Let's see. No, whoops. Sorry. All the tabbing. I'm going to grab the API key here from Stripe. Again, this is just my test API key, and I'll probably remember to roll it after creating this tutorial. I'm going to grab that and just paste that right over here. Okay, so this is where we'll put the API key, and I'm going to hit save. And now, if I go ahead and just going to make sure I published, if I go to the live site and I go to checkout, we should be able to check out via Stripe. So let's go ahead and test it out. So here I am on the live site, and I'm at the checkout stage again, ready to make the payment. And I'm going to go ahead and click place order and pay. And it's taking a little longer because we're actually doing something. And here we are. We're in Stripe. Okay, the product name is here. I'm a product. The the price is here, $85, and I can make a payment. Okay, nothing is going to happen after I make the payment. You're going to get the money, or the person will get the money in the store, but nothing's going to happen after that. So that's the next stage that we need to deal with. But we got to this point where we're actually creating this checkout page. There are likely some things that we're going to need to change in this code as well. For example, I am providing information to Stripe about these products in terms of like name and price, but I haven't passed in any kind of like product ID from Wix, which I'm likely going to need in order to communicate back to Wix and tell it, what products were purchased, unless Wix already knows how to do it themselves once the payment is complete and they get that webhook. So it might go either way. But if you got to this point and you're following along, I would be pretty proud. So first, give yourself a round of applause for getting this far. And now we're going to continue on to the next stage of the integration. Okay, so the next step based on the Wix tutorial is to set up the refund transaction function. And let me just show you where that is, just to give you a little reminder. So that's over here inside of the Stripe.js. And here we can see that we have connect account, which we set up. We have create transaction, which we set up. And the last one over here in this file is refund transaction. And basically that is to set up the process through which from your Wix dashboard, you can refund an order and then refund it through the payment provider. Since this connection is rather similar to the one that we just did, just using a different endpoint in Stripe, what I want to do is actually move forward to the next part of the tutorial, which is a little more fundamental, and that is setting up the HTTP endpoints. And essentially what this will do is allow the third-party payment provider to communicate back to Wix the status of the payment so that Wix can show that the order has been placed and what the payment status inside of your Wix site's dashboard. Okay, so we've had communication in one direction, and you might be able to see payments that were made on the side of the payment provider, but you won't be able to see anything inside of your Wix dashboard, which is a little problematic if that's kind of where you're organizing your entire store and your orders and your sales. So that's what we're going to do now. And this essentially utilizes what's called HTTP functions in Wix. So it's a way of setting up a webhook so that a third party can send stuff to our website essentially. And I have some other tutorials specifically on this topic, so if you feel like you're getting lost as I'm explaining this, please feel free to just search my channel for like webhooks or HTTP functions, and you should get enough background about that to get up to pace. So this stage is actually going to comprise of two parts. The first part is we're just going to set up the actual endpoint inside of our HTTP functions and make sure that we are listening and getting the event from Stripe. The second part will be to set up this submit event function, which is essentially communicating the results of that transaction to Wix itself. So let's start out with the HTTP function, and we're going to do that right over here. So inside of our backend code, we're going to add a special kind of file, which is expose site API. So let me just scroll down, make sure you can see this, expose site API. And once I click that, you'll see here that we have added in the HTTP functions.js file. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get rid of everything that we have in here. And I'm actually going to draw some inspiration here from what Wix has already set up. So we see here that we have an export of an async function, export async function. And this asynchronous function, they called it post update transaction. I'll use the same language. And you'll notice here that there's an underscore here inside of the function definition, and that is going to separate two parts of this HTTP function. One is the method that needs to be used by a third party to call this endpoint, and the other one is going to be the actual name of the endpoint, and I'll show you what that URL is going to look like in a moment. And once we get some kind of request here to this endpoint, we're going to have that request as a parameter, request, and then we're going to first just log out this request. So console.log request. And what we can do is we can return something that's called OK. And in order to return that, we will import OK from HTTP, what's it called? Wix HTTP functions. Okay, so I'm going to return here OK, and basically that's an indication to the third-party server that tried to contact us that everything went through okay. Obviously, you only want to send that if it was really okay, because often what will happen is that if something is trying to contact you via the webhook and they don't get the okay response, they probably will try again at a certain interval. So like they'll try after 30 seconds, then again after a minute, and then again after 5 minutes. Eventually they might just call it a timeout and give up. But generally that's how robust APIs are built, that they will continue to try and contact you until they get the okay that you've actually received the message. That's why this okay is important. And now we're ready to essentially test out this endpoint with Stripe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish the site, and then I'm going to grab the URL for this endpoint and paste it somewhere in Stripe, which I'll show you in a moment. Okay, so I've published my site with this endpoint, and I've also opened up the documentation here inside of the Velo reference on the right, which indicates how the URL to this endpoint should look. Okay, so here we have an example endpoint. So this one's a get endpoint that's called my function. And you can see here, this is what the URL is supposed to look like. And they give two different examples, one of a Wix premium site and one of a free Wix site. Since our site is premium because we need it for the SPI, so it's going to look more something like this. Okay, and you don't need this John and Doe there. You pretty much need the domain, and you need underscore functions, and you need the name of your function. Okay, so let's set that up here inside, just so that we have a record of what the endpoint is. So it's going to be https:// and it's going to be www. Whatever this site is called, which I need to remember. So let's go over here. I'm going to click view site. Okay, so it's going to be, this is going to be the domain. I'm going to copy that because that's going to be a lot easier. So I'm just going to paste that right over here. And it's going to be /_. functions slash update transaction. I'm just going to actually copy the exact wording from here. That way, if I made a typo, at least I made the same typo in both places. So this is essentially the endpoint. Okay, this is the URL that we want to be giving to Stripe. And now let's take a peek in the Stripe documentation and see essentially how we're going to set up this webhook. And if you scroll all the way down here to the quick start for the checkout setup, then we see here documentation about fulfillment. Okay, and fulfillment is essentially, how to communicate that the payment has been made to somewhere else, essentially, which is exactly what we want. And so in order to allow us to fulfill the order, essentially. So we're going to be wanting to set up an event handler. Okay, and we'll see how to do that in a moment. And we're going to listen for this checkout.session.completed event. Okay, that's essentially what we're going to be listening for. And we're going to need to do some setup here in order to verify that the events came from Stripe and stuff like that. But first, I just want to make sure that we're getting the event in general. Okay, so in order to do that, what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and go to our Stripe dashboard. If I can find it, that's right over here. And you can see here that under developers, there's a section called Webhooks. And what I'm going to do, you can see I have a few webhooks here from previous projects and tutorials. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a new endpoint. And here is where we need to put that URL that we just created. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it here from the side and paste that in here. Description optional, I'm going to leave it out. I'm listening to events on my account because I'm connecting the integration directly to my own personal account. If you were doing something with connected accounts with Stripe Connect, then it would be a little different. And here I'm going to select the events. And we know that we need session. Let's see if I can find session. Or was it checkout.session? Let me double check. It was checkout.session. So it's checkout. So we want here checkout.session.completed. If you want, you can also listen to, if payment failed or payment succeeded, session expired, just to make sure that, and handle those situations as well from the Wix side. For now, I'm just going to be listening to checkout.session.completed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add that event in, and I'm going to click here on the bottom in order to complete the addition of the endpoint. Okay, so now we've added in this endpoint. We've added it on the Wix side, and what we can do is go through a mock checkout. So we'll check something out from our site and we'll do a fake payment, and then we'll see if we get this actual request logged in the console. Okay, so I have gone through the entire checkout process until payment. And since I am in test mode here, which you'll want to be while you're implementing this and testing, you can essentially make fake payments and go through the entire cycle, including getting all the events and everything without actually paying any money, which is important because you'll probably be doing a lot of testing. In addition, I've also opened up the logs here in the back. Make sure to do that so that you can actually catch the console log from the request. So I'm going to go through here with the payment. I just need to put in here, because I have link connected, so I'm just going to go through 0000. If you're not using link, then you can use one of like Stripe's fake credit card numbers. Just search their website for those numbers, and you can kind of put in like one of their test credit card numbers and just check out and not pay anything. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to click pay. And if this is successful, then it should take me to a page on the site that doesn't exist yet, which is the success page that we set up. It seems to be taking a while. Okay, so yeah, so here we are. I'm at our website /success.html, which obviously does not exist at the moment because we haven't set it up yet. But that's just an example of how the flow would work for a successful payment. Then what you could do here on this page, for example, is to get the information from the checkout and display maybe an order confirmation or something along those lines. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the logs now, and you can see here, okay, here essentially is that log that I put there in the HTTP functions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this. I'm going to grab all this. Let's see. I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to open up something that I call JSON, a tool that I like to use called JSON viewer.stack.hu. It basically just takes text and displays it in kind of like a nice JSON. So here's the text. Obviously, it's impossible to see anything here. And then you go into viewer, and then it just shows it to you kind of in like this nice tree hierarchical format that's easy to navigate here. So here we can see the entire request, and we can see we have some headers here. We have the body. So I didn't extract the body at this point, but what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at so here I see something called Stripe signature, which we might need at some point. We're going to take a look at the instructions on Stripe for how to essentially extract the information from this event, because it's kind of encrypted. And this again is something that's unique to Stripe. So at this point, you're going to want to go and take a look at the documentation for whatever provider you're connecting and find that info for how to read the events. It might be a lot more simple than Stripe. I feel like they're, extra cautious. Some might be a little more straightforward than this. So again, this is kind of a very Stripe specific thing, but I'm going to show you how to do it just so that we can actually move forward with our integration. Okay, so here is the Stripe documentation regarding verifying the events. And upon looking at this documentation, I noticed something which might end up being a little problematic for us. And that is that since this uses the Stripe package in order to construct the event using a certain signature and a secret key and whatnot, this doesn't fit in so beautifully with the integration that we're doing. Because if you recall, we provided the API key to the connect through the connect account, through the config, and we didn't store it essentially as a secret inside of our secret manager. And in order to implement this, we would also have to take this API key and store it in our secret manager, because this HTTP function that we're building doesn't have any access to the SPI, to the integration. Okay, if you get my drift. So that means that if we were to implement the Stripe package for the verification, it's possible, and especially like if I was doing this just for like one client on one site, I wasn't trying to build anything scalable, there's totally nothing wrong with it. Okay, just make it work, and it works, and it's not insecure or anything like that. But it doesn't really fit in so beautifully with the logic of the SPI. So if you wanted to play the SPI way and only have the secret essentially stored through the get config of the SPI, you would have to use the manual verification method. Okay, so if you go over here to a different part of the documentation about webhooks, you can see here instructions for doing it manually. So here, like, you can toggle through verify with official libraries, which is what I just explained, and verify manually. And you'll see how there's this nice little recommended parentheses here, and that's because the manual verification is quite complex. I have not attempted it, and I don't plan on attempting it right now. And that is why, at the moment, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to choose to skip the verification process. And the reasoning being that since I'm not teaching the Stripe API right now per se, but really the SPI integration, and while some of you might be trying to integrate Stripe, a lot of you might not be trying to integrate Stripe, and I want to really focus on the key aspects of the SPI or the service plugin, and not get lost here in like another sub tutorial of an hour of doing Stripe verification. So I'm going to forego that at the moment, and I'm going to just get the payload or the body from the request and move forward assuming that it's verified. So here I am back in the editor, back in our HTTP functions file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the body from the request. In order to do that, I'm going to say here const payload equals to, and this is going to be a promise, so I'm going to use the await keyword, and we're going to have here request.body.json. Okay, and I'm going to change our log over here from logging the request in its entirety to just logging this payload. Okay, right over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish this change. And luckily, within the Stripe dashboard, we have this option here to resend a webhook that was already sent. So I don't need to go and do checkout every single time just to test this. I can just go ahead and resend the webhook that we already sent. So let me go ahead and publish, and I'll meet you in the logs in order to see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit resend here for our webhook. And here in the site logs, let's see what we see in terms of okay, so here this essentially now is our payload. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to copy it over here. And I'm going to paste it inside of our JSON viewer. Okay, and now we can see here that the type of the event is checkout.session.completed, which is an indication to me that the payment has been made. And here I have a lot of different kind of metadata about the payment and the checkout and everything like that if we are to need it in the future. And we will need this in a moment. Like we have payment intent here. We have the ID of the checkout. If you recall, we used that at one point and we're going to need it again. So that's what we have here in terms of the payload. And now that we have this payload and it's verified, what we can do is we can move forward and actually submit this event to Wix. Okay, so in order to submit the event to Wix, first we're going to need to import this payment provider backend from Wix Payment Provider Backend. So I'm going to do that right up here on the top of our file. And then we're going to have something like this. So we're going to say that, let's say, if the event is checkout.session.complete, then we're going to go ahead and submit the event. We're going to return OK, else we're going to return bad request. So I'm actually going to copy over this code snippet. And I'm going to paste it right over here. Okay, and let's make some adjustments to make it really fit with our code. So first here, in terms of the if statement, what we're checking is not this random thing that they have here, but we're going to be checking something about our payload, right? Payload. And we need to find specifically the property that we're looking for. So luckily, I still have the JSON viewer open here. And we're going to be looking for payload 0. And we're going to be looking here for type. Okay, so payload 0 type, checkout.session.completed. Yeah, and I would want to double check the Stripe documentation just to confirm that just receiving this webhook is an indication that payment went through. If I'm not mistaken, that's the case, but that's an important thing to double check when you're doing the integration, especially if you're not using Stripe. What is the thing that you have to check to make sure that the payment went through? Because just because you got a certain webhook, it doesn't mean that you necessarily fulfilled payment. It could be that you have to look for a specific property within the webhook just to verify that. For now, I'm assuming that that's what I need to check. But again, for your scenario, you should check what your payment provider tells you is verification of payment. So what I'm looking here is payload 0 type should be equal to checkout.session.completed. So let me copy that over. I'm going to head here back into the editor. And here I'm going to say payload 0 dot type equals to, and here I'm going to have my session checkout.session.completed, and I have double quotes here so I can get rid of that. Okay, so that's what makes sense for us. And then we're submitting the event here, and we'll talk about these things in a moment because these are going to be important. Here we're going to need to change these two things over here. But for now, let's deal with returning OK. So here, I'm just going to either return OK or bad request. I don't need a specific response. Bad request would indicate to the server that sent me the webhook, so here Stripe in this case, that we didn't successfully process the webhook. Please continue sending it if that's your protocol. So I'm going to go over here and import that as well up here on top, along with OK. And I'm going to get rid of what we have over here. Okay, so we're almost done. Here, in terms of the plugin transaction ID, so if you recall, when we set up our transaction, what was the name of the function? Create transaction, I think it was called. We set the plugin transaction ID to be our checkout ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the checkout ID from our payload. So I'm going to go right over here. And so here we are, we're payload 0 and data object ID. Okay, see if you can remember that. It's it's 0 data object ID. So that's going to be, whoops, right over here. So instead of request.query whatever, here what we're going to have is we're going to have payload 0 data object id. Okay, so that is essentially going to be the checkout ID, which is what Wix has on record as what we use to initiate the checkout for this cart, essentially. The next thing we're going to need to do is going to require a little more legwork, because here we're going to need the Wix transaction ID. But that is something that we have not yet provided to Stripe. So if we haven't provided it to Stripe, then Stripe can't send it back to us, and then we have no way essentially of knowing what it is at this point. So we're going to have to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to need to find a way to provide the Wix transaction ID as metadata to the Stripe checkout in order to get that back when this checkout is actually completed. So here I am with the Stripe documentation, and I'm inside of specifically the session object endpoint. And this is essentially what we were building when we called the checkout endpoint. So let me just show you that here inside of our files. So if I open up stripe.web.js, okay, right over here. So we weren't using the manual API, we're using the package, but essentially the things that we can pass in. So here in stripe.checkout.session.create, so right, we passed in the line items, the mode, and the other stuff. So here there's a lot of other stuff that we can pass in that's all listed over here in the session object. And one of those things that we can pass in is metadata. So basically just general information about this checkout that we want to provide to Stripe, usually because we want to get it back on the other end. So I'm going to add in some metadata here when we create the Stripe session. Okay, so I'm going to add that here on the bottom. Metadata. And the metadata that I'm going to add in here is the Wix transaction ID. Okay, and this is technically going to be a parameter that we pass in to this function. So let me grab that up here, and I'm going to pass this as a parameter to this web method. So we have API key, we have line items. So let me add in here, before the line items, I'll add the Wix transaction ID. Okay, and essentially what this means is that here in the metadata, we have one property, which is essentially Wix transaction ID, Wix transaction ID. Okay, so whatever the parameter that we pass into the web method is going to appear here. This is just a slightly more concise way of writing that. So now that we've set that up over here inside of our checkout session, where we're creating the checkout session, what we'll need to do is now set that up inside of our create transaction function. So let me go over here back here to stripe.js, where we have our create transaction function. And the first thing I'm going to do is add that extra parameter here, just that I don't forget. So it's Wix transaction action ID. And now we actually need to get this Wix transaction ID, and we should be able to get it from the options that are passed into the create transaction function. So let me go over here, back to our docs, Wix payment provider, backend. That's not what I want. Let me find it. Create transaction. Okay, right over here. And we can see here that Wix transaction ID is, usually I like to double check inside of the Velo documentation itself and not just work off examples. But here I'm gonna risk it. And if it doesn't work, then we'll double check the docs. So I'm gonna grab this, and this should be at the top level of this options function, options object. So I should be able to extract it just right over here. Okay, right over there, just get the Wix transaction ID. And now, after I've set that up, what technically should happen is that when after I publish the site, of course, when I make a checkout and I get that webhook back from Stripe, I should see the Wix transaction ID there in the metadata and be able to use it. So let me go ahead. I'm going to complete a checkout with this new setup and show you what data we get there in the webhook payload. So we're back. I completed another checkout, and what I pasted here now in JSON viewer is essentially the payload, the new payload that came in. And as you can see, we have this metadata property here with the Wix transaction ID. Okay, so that is working and is awesome. I did gain some interesting insights here as I was doing this test. So one thing that I wanted to point out, well, let me take one step back. I had misinterpreted over here. So basically, when Wix gives you the logs, essentially they wrap it inside of an array. And so this outer array is not actually part of the payload, it's just part of Wix. So the payload itself is just an object. So that essentially caused some errors with the deconstruction, because it said here cannot read properties of undefined type, which essentially over here is because I tried to drill down into the payload array, which doesn't exist, and then get type. So essentially it threw an error here. And what that means is that we actually ended up returning bad request. Okay, and that is what you can see over here, that the delivery failed, and Stripe will try the event again in another hour. Okay, that's what you can see over there. So that's just an unintended simulation of what would happen if you didn't actually manage to, if the webhook didn't work and you returned bad request and not this okay here on the bottom. So that's what happens, but that's what it would look like. So I'm just going to do some fixing up here. So this doesn't need to be 0. This doesn't need to be 0. And this here needs to be pretty similar to this. So it needs to be here, payload.data.object, but instead of .id, it's going to be .metadata.wix transaction ID. Okay, and now what that means is that theoretically, if everything goes smoothly now with this next test, I'm going to publish the site and I'm going to try and check out again. If everything goes smoothly, we should see an order placed in our dashboard and we should see the cart emptied after the payment. Okay, so it would feel exactly like if you were checking out with Wix stores with one of the other payment providers that Wix provides out of the box. So that same seamless kind of experience, that is technically what we should have now if everything is working and I don't have another small bug or typo or something like that. So let me go ahead and publish this. Let me check out again, and let's see if this works as I expect. Okay, so I'm here at the moment of checkout, and I've been using the same product every time because my cart never emptied. Because Wix essentially never knew that I actually paid for the order, so the cart kept on existing with one item in it. So that would be one of the tests here that this is working successfully. So I'm going to go here and place order and pay. And that should take us to Stripe. This is a good check to make sure I didn't break anything with the adjustments that we made. I did not. I'm going to pay with link. And this is going through, processing. Okay, so the payment went through. This is something we haven't set up yet, the success.html page. But if I just go back to the site, then you can see here that my cart is empty. So this, I know you might not have seen it yet, but trust me, every time that I tested, when I came back here, the cart still had one item in it. And that's because Wix never knew that we actually completed the payment. And if I go here to the orders, so 0 orders, this is how it started. And I'm just going to go ahead and give it a refresh. And you can see that we have an order. So if you've gotten this far with me, then you really deserve a round of applause. And you can see here all of the information that you would see from your typical Wix order. You can see that it's marked as paid. It's not fulfilled at the moment yet. You can see the pricing, the quantity, everything about the order. So this really kind of wraps up the initial part of the integration. And now let me move to some closing remarks and really just highlight what we did cover, what we didn't cover, and where to go from here. Okay, so I am going to wrap up this tutorial now. You would be right in saying that we haven't covered every single detail of this implementation, because to bring it from the level that we've gotten to until level of perfection would take another probably few hours of work of testing and implementing a few things that I'm going to point out here that we missed. But I do think that if you've seen this entire tutorial and you read the documentation, you should have the tools to handle this by yourself, because we really did cover the fundamental foundations of this implementation. So just in a recap what we did. So we created a new payment provider plugin. Yes, we did that. We implemented the config so that we can set up the connection from our dashboard. We didn't use custom images, but that should be pretty easy for you to figure out. We didn't really demonstrate some of the more complex situations here. For example, integrating mandatory fields for the billing. That would be per your necessity, and that would require extra testing and stuff like that. But that's one thing that we didn't touch in so much in depth here. We also didn't try multiple kinds of credential fields. We also really just did a simple field, but we did kind of explain what the different field options are. We successfully implemented the config, and then we moved on to the 3 functions, which is connect account, which we did do, but we did it in a very simplified manner, which I still think is the manner that would be relevant to most people who are just trying to implement this integration personally for their own website and not trying to build something to scale. So, or something with, complex payment situations like Stripe Connect, marketplace style stuff, which might be a future tutorial. So please do let me know in the comments if that interests you. We then talked about the create transaction. We talked about how to build out the API interaction in the backend, how to call that inside of create transaction and pass in the relevant data so that we can get everything that we need back on the other end. So that is a big check mark. And we did skip the refund transaction. And that's because on principle, it should work very similarly to the create transaction, just with a different endpoint inside of your API. Also, there might be some APIs or third-party providers which don't allow you to create refunds through an API. You might need to do it manually through a dashboard, in which case you could still have one part of this service plugin, this SPI, but you would be missing a certain part of it. You wouldn't be able to refund things from your Wix dashboard. So this is something that we skipped, but I do think that you have the tools to implement it with what we've done and with the documentation. So that is something that we skipped. We then moved on to the HTTP endpoints, and we showed how to create an endpoint that would listen for an event complete or a payment complete event, and how to then submit that event back into Wix in order to display the order in the dashboard and really notify the Wix system that the payment has been completed and to move on and do the next steps. Okay, so that is something that we did. We did not do the same thing for the refund. Okay, so technically you would have to have a corresponding HTTP endpoint for the refund to get notified by the third-party provider that the refund has been processed and to notify Wix that the refund has actually been processed. So that would be very similar again, just instead here with the submit event, your event would be a refund event and it would not be a transaction event. Okay, so that is something, again, that we did not touch on with refunds, but otherwise we touched on pretty much everything. One topic which I mentioned briefly, but we didn't talk about so much in depth, is how to handle different errors and different error codes. I didn't really do a demonstration of that because it would be quite subjective to different providers. But I did show you where you can find the information about those different error codes and where you would want to have those error codes triggered throughout the SPI. So I do recommend that if you're setting up the full implementation, to set up those error codes just so that you know when things are going wrong and why they're going wrong. And with that, we pretty much wrap up this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Except for just subscribing, you also have the option to become a member, which would allow you to see videos like this in advance, sometimes even several weeks in advance. It will give you access to the full Velo for Beginners course and to the new course that is going to be coming out soon in installments. And depending on the level of membership, you can also join me for a monthly Q&A session for members only and ask anything that you want about Wix and Velo and get that information live. So if you're interested in that, just please check out the channel memberships. And even if you don't, I will see you next time.